Hello, and welcome to Bookspot. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of The City and the Stars by Arthur C. Clarke. Our hero Alvin has met with Kedron the Jester. Alvin wasted no time learning all that he could about Kedron. Jesserac, as usual, was his main source of information. The old tutor gave him a carefully factual account of his meetings with the jester and added what little he knew about the other's mode of life. Insofar as such a thing was possible in Diaspar, Kedron was a recluse. No one knew where he lived or anything about his way of life. The last jest he had contrived had been a rather childish prank involving a general paralysis of the moving ways. That had been 50 years ago. A century earlier, he had let loose a particularly revolting dragon which had wandered round the city, eating every existing specimen of the works of the currently most popular sculptor. The artist himself, justifiably alarmed when the beast's single-minded diet became obvious, had gone into hiding and not emerged until the monster had vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. One thing was obvious from these accounts. Kedron must have a profound understanding of the machines and powers that ruled the city, and could make them obey his will in ways which no one else could do. Presumably, there must be some overriding control which prevented any too ambitious jester from causing permanent and irreparable damage to the complex structure of Diaspar. Alvin filed all this information away, but made no move to contact Kedron. Though he had many questions to ask the jester, his stubborn streak of independence, perhaps the most truly unique of all his qualities, made him determined to discover all he could by his own unaided efforts. He had embarked on a project which might keep him busy for years, but as long as he felt that he was moving toward his goal, he was happy. Like some traveler of old mapping out an unknown land, he had begun a systematic exploration of Diaspar. He spent his weeks and days prowling through the lonely towers at the margin of the city in the hope that somewhere he might discover a way out into the world beyond. During the course of his search, he found a dozen of the great air vents opening high above the desert, but they were all barred, and even if the bars had not been there, the sheer drop of almost a mile was sufficient obstacle. He found no other exits, though he explored 1,000 corridors and 10,000 empty chambers. All these buildings were in that perfect and spotless condition which the people of Diaspar took for granted as part of the normal order of things. Sometimes Alvin would meet a wandering robot, obviously on a tour of inspection, and he never failed to question the machine. He learnt nothing because the machines he encountered were not keyed to respond to human speech or thoughts. Though they were aware of his presence, for they floated politely aside to let him pass, they refused to engage in conversation. There were times when Alvin did not see another human being for days. When he felt hungry, he would go into one of the living compartments and order a meal. Miraculous machines, whose existence he seldom gave a thought, would wake to life after eons of slumber. The patterns they had stored in their memories would flicker on the edge of reality, organizing and directing the matter they controlled. And so a meal, prepared by a master chef 100 million years before, would be called again into existence to delight the palate or merely to satisfy the appetite. The loneliness of this deserted world, the empty shells surrounding the living heart of the city, did not depress Alvin. He was used to loneliness, even when he was among those he called his friends. This ardent exploration, absorbing all his energy and interest, made him forget for the moment the mystery of his heritage and the anomaly that cut him off from all his fellows. He had explored less than 1/100th of the city's rim when he decided that he was wasting his time. His decision was not the result of impatience, but of sheer common sense. If need be, he was prepared to come back and finish the task, even if it took him the remainder of his life. He had seen enough, however, to convince him that if a way out of Diaspar did exist, it would not be found as easily as this. He might waste centuries in fruitless search unless he called upon the assistance of wiser men. Gesserac told him flatly that he knew no road out of Diaspar and doubted if one existed. The information machines, when Alvin had questioned them, had searched their almost infinite memories in vain. They could tell him every detail of the city's history back to the beginning of recorded times, back to the barrier beyond which the Dawn Ages lay forever hidden. But they could not answer Alvin's simple question, or else some higher power had forbidden them to do so. He would have to see Kedron again. Chapter 7. "You took your time," said Kedron, "but I knew you would call sooner or later." This confidence annoyed Alvin. He did not like to think that his behavior could be predicted so accurately. He wondered if the jester had watched all his fruitless searching and knew exactly what he had been doing. "I'm trying to find a way out of the city," he said bluntly. "There must be one, and I think you could help me find it." Kedron was silent for a moment. There was still time, if he wished, to turn back from the road that stretched before him and which led into a future beyond all his powers of prophecy. No one else would have hesitated. No other man in the city, even if he had the power, would have dared to disturb the ghosts of an age that had been dead for millions of centuries. Perhaps there was no danger. Perhaps nothing could alter the perpetual changelessness of Diaspar. But if there was any risk of something strange and new coming into the world, this might be the last chance to ward it off. Kedron was content with the order of things as it was. True, he might upset that order from time to time, but only by a little. He was a critic, not a revolutionary. On the placidly flowing river of time, he wished only to make a few ripples. He shrank from diverting its course. The desire for adventure, other than that of the mind, had been eliminated from him as carefully and thoroughly as from all the other citizens of Diaspar. Yet he still possessed, though it was almost extinguished, that spark of curiosity that was once man's greatest gift. He was still prepared to take a risk. He looked at Alvin and tried to remember his own youth, his own dreams of 1,000 years before. Any moment of his past that he cared to choose was still clear and sharp when he turned his memory upon it. Like beads upon a string, this life and all the ones before it stretched back through the ages. He could seize and re-examine any one he wished. Most of those older Kedrons were strangers to him now. The basic pattern might be the same, but the weight of experience separated him from them forever. If he wished, he could wash his mind clear of all his earlier incarnations, when next he walked back into the hall of creation to sleep until the city called him forth again. But that would be a kind of death, and he was not ready for that yet. He was still prepared to go on collecting all that life could offer, like a chambered nautilus, patiently adding new cells to its slowly expanding spiral. In his youth, he had been no different from his companions. It was not until he came of age that the latent memories of his earlier life came flooding back, that he had taken up the role for which he had been destined so long ago. Sometimes he felt resentment that the intelligence which had contrived Diaspar with such infinite skill could even now, after all these ages, make him move like a puppet across their stage. Here, perhaps, was a chance of obtaining a long-delayed revenge. A new actor had appeared who might ring down the curtain for the last time on a play which already had seen far too many acts. Sympathy for one whose loneliness must be even greater than his own, an ennui produced by ages of repetition, and an impish sense of fun, these were the discordant factors which prompted Kedron to act. "I may be able to help you," he told Alvin, "or I may not. I don't wish to raise any false hopes. Meet me in half an hour at the intersection of Radius 3 and Ring 2. If I cannot do anything else, at least I can promise you an interesting journey." Alvin was at the rendezvous 10 minutes ahead of time, though it was on the other side of the city. He waited impatiently as the moving ways swept eternally past him, bearing the placid and contented people of the city about their unimportant business. At last he saw the tall figure of Kedron appear in the distance, and a moment later he was for the first time in the physical presence of Kedron. This was no projected image. When they touched palms in the ancient greeting, Kedron was real enough. The jester sat down on one of the marble balustrades and regarded Alvin with a curious intentness. "I wonder," he said, "if you know what you are asking, and I wonder what you would do if you obtained it. Do you really imagine that you could leave the city, even if you found a way?" "I'm sure of it," replied Alvin bravely enough, though Kedron could sense the uncertainty in his voice. "Then let me tell you something which you may not know. You see those towers there?" Kedron pointed to the twin peaks of Power Central and City Hall, Council Hall, staring at each other across a canyon a mile deep. "Suppose I was to lay a perfectly firm plank between the two towers, a plank only 6 inches wide. Could you walk across it?" Alvin hesitated. "I don't know," he answered. "I wouldn't like to try. I'm quite sure you could never do it. You'd get giddy and fall off before you'd gone a dozen paces. Yet if that same plank was supported just clear of the ground, you'd be able to walk along it without difficulty." "And what does that prove?" "A simple point I'm trying to make. In the two experiments I've described, the plank would be exactly the same in both cases. One of those wheeled robots you sometimes meet could cross it just as easily as if it was bridging those two towers and as if it was laid along the ground. We couldn't, because we have a fear of heights. It may be irrational, but it's too powerful to be ignored. It is built into us. We are born with it. In the same way, we have a fear of space. Show any man in Diaspar a road out of the city, a road that might be just like this road in front of us now, and he could not go far along it. He would have to turn back, as you would turn back if you started to cross a plank between those two towers." "But why?" said Alvin. "There must have been a time—" I know," said Kedron. "Men once went out over the whole world and to the stars themselves. Something changed them and gave them this fear with which they are now born. You alone imagine you do not possess it. Well, we shall see. I'm taking you to Council Hall." The hall was one of the largest buildings in the city and was almost entirely given over to the machines which were the real administrators of Diaspar. Not far from its summit was the chamber where the council met on those infrequent occasions when it had any business to discuss. The wide entrance swallowed them up, and Kedron strode forward into the golden gloom. Alvin had never entered the council hall before. There was no rule against it. There were few rules against anything in Diaspar, but like everyone else, he had a certain half-religious awe of the place. In a world that had no gods, Council Hall was the nearest thing to a temple. Kedron never hesitated as he led Alvin along corridors and down ramps that were obviously made for wheeled machines, not human traffic. Some of these ramps zigzagged down into the depths at such steep angles that it would have been impossible to keep a footing on them had not gravity been twisted to compensate for the slope. They came at last to a closed door which slid silently open as they approached, then barred their retreat. Ahead was another door, which did not open as they came up to it. Kedron made no move to touch the door, but stood motionless in front of it. After a short pause, a quiet voice said, "Please state your names." "I am Kedron the Jester. My companion is Alvin." "And your business?" "Sheer curiosity." Rather to Alvin's surprise, the door opened at once. In his experience, if one gave facetious replies to machines, it always led to confusion, and one had to go back to the beginning. The machine that had interrogated Kedron must have been a very sophisticated one, far up in the hierarchy of the central computer. They met no more barriers, but Alvin suspected that they had passed many tests of which he had no knowledge. A short corridor brought them out abruptly into a huge circular chamber with a sunken floor. And set in that floor was something so astonishing that for a moment Alvin was overwhelmed with wonder. He was looking down upon the entire city of Diaspar, spread out before him with its tallest buildings barely reaching to his shoulder. He spent so long picking out familiar places and observing unexpected vistas that it was some time before he paid any notice to the rest of the chamber. Its walls were covered with a microscopically detailed pattern of black and white squares. The pattern itself was completely irregular, and when he moved his eyes quickly, he got the impression that it was flickering swiftly, though it never changed. At frequent intervals around the chamber were keyboard-operated machines of some type, each complete with a vision screen and a seat for the operator. Kedron let Alvin look his fill. Then he pointed to the diminutive city and said, "Do you know what that is?" Alvin was tempted to answer, "A model, I suppose," but that answer was so obvious that he was sure it must be wrong. So he shook his head and waited for Kedron to answer his own question. "You remember," said the jester, "that I once told you how the city was maintained, how the memory banks hold its pattern frozen forever. Those banks are all around us, with all their immeasurable store of information, completely defining the city as it is today. Every atom of Diaspar is somehow keyed, by forces we've forgotten, to the matrices buried in these walls." He waved toward the perfect, infinitely detailed simulacrum of Diaspar that lay below them. "That is no model. It does not really exist. It is merely the projected image of the pattern held in the memory banks, and therefore it is absolutely identical to the city itself. These viewing machines here enable one to magnify any desired portion, to look at it life-size or larger. They are used when it is necessary to make alterations to the design, though it is a very long time since that was done. If you want to know what Diaspar is like, this is the place to come. You can learn more here in a few days than you would in a lifetime of actual exploring." "It's wonderful," said Alvin. "How many people know that it exists?" "Oh, a good many, but it seldom concerns them. The council comes down here from time to time. No alterations to the city can be made unless they are all here, and not even then if the central computer doesn't approve of the proposed change. I doubt if this room is visited more than 2 or 3 times a year." Alvin wanted to know how Kedron had access to it, and then remembered that many of his more elaborate jests must have involved a knowledge of the city's inner mechanisms that could only have come from very profound study. It must be one of the jester's privileges to go anywhere and learn anything. He could have no better guide to the secrets of Diaspar. "What you are looking for may not exist," said Kedron, "but if it does, this is where you will find it. Let me show you how to operate the monitors." For the next hour, Alvin sat before one of the vision screens, learning to use the controls. He could select at will any point in the city and examine it with any degree of magnification. Streets and towers and walls and moving ways flashed across the screen as he changed the coordinates. It was as though he was an all-seeing, disembodied spirit that could move effortlessly over the whole of Diaspar, unhindered by any physical obstruction. Yet it was not, in reality, Diaspar that he was examining. He was moving through the memory cells, looking at the dream image of the city, the dream which had the power to hold the real Diaspar untouched by time for 1,000 million years. He could see only the part of the city which was permanent. The people who walked its streets were no part of this frozen image. For his purpose, that did not matter. His concern now was purely with the creation of stone and metal in which he was imprisoned, not those who shared, however willingly, his confinement. He searched for and presently found the Tower of Lorraine, and moved swiftly through the corridors and passageways which he had already explored in reality. As the image of the stone grill expanded before his eyes, he could almost feel the cold wind that had blown ceaselessly through it for perhaps half the entire history of mankind, and which was blowing now. He came up to the grill, looked out, and saw nothing. For a moment, the shock was so great that he almost doubted his own memory. Had his vision of the desert been nothing more than a dream? Then he remembered the truth. The desert was no part of Diaspar, and therefore no image of it existed in the phantom world he was exploring. Anything might lie beyond the grill in reality. His monitor screen could never show it. Yet it could show him something that no living man had ever seen. Alvin advanced his viewpoint through the grill out into the nothingness beyond the city. He turned the control, which altered the direction of his vision, so that he looked backward along the way he had come. And there behind him lay Diaspar, seen from the outside. To the computers, the memory circuits, and all the multitudinous mechanisms which created the image at which Alvin was looking, it was merely a simple problem of perspective. They knew the form of the city, therefore they could show it as it would appear from outside. Yet, even though he could appreciate how the trick was done, the effect on Alvin was overwhelming. In spirit, if not in reality, he had escaped from the city. He appeared to be hanging in space, a few feet away from the sheer wall of the Tower of Lorraine. For a moment, he stared at the smooth gray surface before his eyes. Then he touched the control and let his viewpoint drop toward the ground. Now that he knew the possibilities of this wonderful instrument, his plan of action was clear. There was no need to spend months and years exploring Diaspar from the inside, room by room and corridor by corridor. From this new vantage point, he could wing his way along the outside of the city and could see at once any openings that might lead to the desert and the world beyond. The sense of victory, of achievement, made him feel lightheaded and anxious to share his joy. He turned to Kedron, wishing to thank the jester for having made this possible. But Kedron was gone, and it took only a moment's thought to realize why. Alvin was perhaps the only person in Diaspar who could look unaffected upon the images that were now drifting across the screen. Kedron could help him in his search, but even the jester shared the strange terror of the universe which had pinned mankind for so long inside its little world. He had left Alvin to continue his quest alone. The sense of loneliness, which for a little while had lifted from Alvin's soul, pressed down upon him once more. But this was no time for melancholy. There was too much to do. He shifted back to the monitor screen, set the image of the city wall drifting slowly across it, and began his search. Diaspar saw little of Alvin for the next few weeks, though only a few people noticed his absence. Jesserac, when he discovered that his erstwhile pupil was spending all his time at Council Hall instead of prowling around the frontier of the city, felt slightly relieved, imagining that Alvin could come to no trouble there. Ariston and Etania called his room once or twice, found that he was out, and thought nothing of it. Alystra was a little more persistent. For her own peace of mind, it was a pity that she had become infatuated with Alvin when there were so many more suitable choices. Alystra had never had any difficulty in finding partners, but by comparison with Alvin, all the other men she knew were non-entities, cast from the same featureless mold. She would not lose him without a struggle. His aloofness and indifference set a challenge which she could not resist. Yet perhaps her motives were not entirely selfish, and were maternal rather than sexual. Though birth had been forgotten, the feminine instincts of protection and sympathy still remained. Alvin might appear to be stubborn and self-reliant and determined to have his own way, yet Alystra could sense his inner loneliness. When she found that Alvin had disappeared, she promptly asked Jesserac what had happened to him. Jesserac, with only a momentary hesitation, told her. If Alvin did not want company, the answer was in his own hands. His tutor neither approved nor disapproved of this relationship. On the whole, he rather liked Alystra and hoped that her influence would help Alvin adjust himself to life in Diaspar. The fact that Alvin was spending his time at Council Hall could only mean he was engaged on some research project, and this knowledge at least served to quell any suspicions Alystra might have concerning possible rivals. But though her jealousy was not aroused, her curiosity was. She sometimes reproached herself for abandoning Alvin in the Tower of Lorraine, though she knew that if the circumstances were repeated, she would do exactly the same thing again. There was no way of understanding Alvin's mind, she told herself, unless she could discover what he was trying to do. She walked purposefully into the main hall, impressed but not overawed by the hush that fell as soon as she passed through the entrance. The information machines were ranged side by side against the far wall, and she chose one at random. As soon as the recognition signal lit up, she said, "I'm looking for Alvin. He is somewhere in this building. Where can I find him?" Even after a lifetime, one never grew wholly accustomed to the complete absence of time lag when an information machine replied to an ordinary question. There were people who knew, or claimed to know how it was done, and talked learnedly of access time and storage space, but that made the final result nonetheless marvelous. Any question of a purely factual nature within the city's truly enormous range of available information could be answered immediately. Only if complex calculations were involved before a reply could be given would there be any appreciable delay. "He is with the monitors," came the reply. It was not very helpful, since the name conveyed nothing to Alystra. No machine ever volunteered more information than it was asked for, and learning to frame questions properly was an art which often took a long time to acquire. "How do I reach him?" asked Alystra. She would find what the monitors were when she got to them. "I cannot tell you unless you have the permission of the council." This was most unexpected, even disconcerting. There were very few places in Diaspar which could not be visited by anyone who pleased. Alystra was quite certain that Alvin had not obtained council permission, and this could only mean that a higher authority was helping him. The council ruled Diaspar, but the council itself could be overridden by a superior power, the all but infinite intellect of the central computer. It was difficult not to think of the central computer as a living entity, localized in a single spot, though actually it was the sum of all the machines in Diaspar. Even if it was not alive in the biological sense, it certainly possessed at least as much awareness and self-consciousness as a human being. It must know what Alvin was doing, and therefore it must approve. Otherwise, it would have stopped him or referred him to the council, as the information machine had done to Alystra. There was no point in staying here. Alystra knew that any attempt to find Alvin, even if she knew exactly where he was in this enormous building, would be doomed to failure. Doors would fail to open, slideways would reverse when she stood on them, carrying her backwards instead of forwards. Elevator fields would be mysteriously inert, refusing to lift her from one floor to another. If she persisted, she would be gently conveyed out into the street by a polite but firm robot, or else shuttled around and around the council hall until she grew fed up and left of her own volition. She was in a bad temper when she walked out into the street. She was also more than a little puzzled, and for the first time felt that there was some mystery here which made her personal desires and interests seem very trivial indeed. That did not mean they would not be any the less important to her. She had no idea what she was going to do next, but she was sure of one thing. Alvin was not the only person in Diaspar who could be stubborn and persistent. And we will follow these stubborn and persistent people further next time.